Stephen King is easily one of the biggest novelists in the world and isn't shy when talking about things that have inspired his works. One of his most infamous was also inspired by a real-life serial killer. Stephen King's novels have terrorized people for years, but what if one of them was real? Stay tuned to today's video discussing the Stephen King story inspired by a serial killer. First up, the Stephen King novel that was inspired by a real-life serial killer. Stephen King isn't a writer who is shy about talking about what inspired his work in the first place. But did you know that one of his stories was inspired by a real-life serial killer? Well, we all know that Stephen King is a writer who has terrorized generations of readers for decades now, but this all started in 1974 when he published Carrie. Ever since then, he has been a writer that allows his audience to explore various fears and meet various creatures and monsters in his novels and short stories. Many of these have been super successful within books and therefore have been adapted into other media such as television series and films. Misery, It, and The Shining are just a few that we can name. However, when it comes to things that happened that inspired Stephen King when he wanted to write a terrifying tale, the so-called King of Horror has been very open to many sources throughout the years about what influences his works. He has even written characters based on people he met at schools, such as Carrie White and his mother, even himself, as he appears in a few of his own stories through different traumatic events in his life. Unsurprisingly enough, he has also taken a lot of inspiration from real-life horrific events, and even one of his novellas was inspired by the real-life actions of the blind, torture, and kill killer. Did you know that Stephen King's A Good Marriage was inspired by the blind, torture, and kill killer? Stephen King's collection Full Dark, No Stars was released in 2010 and featured a novella named A Good Marriage. This story was written about Darcy Anderson, who has been married to Bob for almost 3 decades. Bob is an accountant from Portland, Maine. One day, she makes a very horrible discovery that in their garage, it seems like Bob has been linked to a series of murders attributed to a serial killer called Beatty. Bob eventually realizes that his wife has figured out his secret and explains an earlier traumatic event in his life provoked homicidal urges within him. When he was younger, a friend planned a school shooting with Bob, but he was hit by a truck before they could do it. He claimed that his best friend then infected him with these certain ideas and turned him into this homicidal maniac. In an afterward piece after Full Dark No Stars came out, Stephen King revealed that A Good Marriage and Bob Anderson were inspired by the BTK killer, Dennis Rader. After witnessing the events, he felt inspired to write a story based upon the public outcry against Rader's real wife, who had been married to him for over 30 years and seemed to not know about what he had been doing and his many horrible crimes. If you don't know the story, Dennis Rader killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991, and even used to send letters to the police and media outlets describing his various crimes. In these letters, he also suggested possible names for his serial killer identity, including the BTK, which meant blind, torture, kill. In one of his various letters, he claimed that what drove him to kill in the first place was the idea of Factor X, which he said was a supernatural element that, according to him, also motivated the famous Jack the Ripper. He also named other killers, such as the Son of Sam and the Hillside Strangler, as those who were connected through this Factor X. Dennis Rader was arrested in February of 2005 and is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences in prison. Just months after his arrest, his wife was granted an emergency divorce. Are there any other Stephen King characters that real-life serial killers inspired? Now that we know that A Good Marriage took a lot of elements from different real-life crimes and especially the BTK killer, many people wonder if other real-life events inspired any other Stephen King stories. For many years, it has been debated whether Pennywise the Clown in It was based upon John Wayne Gacy, an infamous serial killer with many similarities to the clown. Both of the characters dress up as a clown and target young victims. Other characters are said to have been based upon serial killers, such as the Moonlight Man, who was a necrophile and serial killer that appeared to Jessie at her lake house within Gerald's Game. This was a novel published back in 1992 and was later adapted into a film in 2017. Many have said that the Moonlight Man was inspired by Ed Gein, a serial killer known as the Butcher of Plainfield. Many of the inspirations behind Stephen King's most terrifying characters and novels make them much scarier for the audience, but show that he can write brave characters that confront them in various ways. And now, on to more Stephen King news and information to wrap up today's video. Next, Stand By Me, true story. Was it inspired by the childhood of Stephen King? For years now, there has has been a lot of reason to believe that one of Stephen King's most infamous stories, Stand By Me, might have been inspired by the real-life traumatic events from Stephen King's childhood. Of course, Stephen King is best known for his various horror tales, which take up most of his work, but he is by no means only adept at writing horror. On a few occasions throughout his decades of writing, Stephen King